It is the spring of 1945, and the war in Europe is for all practical purposes over. The great armies of the Third Reich have been shattered. Berlin is burning. Hitler is dead in his bunker. Yet on the dusty roads of a broken Germany, something extraordinary is still happening. Something that speaks not to the machinery of war, but to the character of one of its most volatile and brilliant commanders. General George S. Patton, commander of the United States Third Army, liberator of France, the man the Germans called the cowboy general, the officer whose armored columns had advanced faster and farther than any in the history of modern warfare, is driving through a village in Bavaria. His jeep slows near a crowd of dazed German civilians and ragged soldiers emerging from the chaos of defeat, and from the rubble, from amongst the surrendered and the broken, a young boy steps forward. He cannot be more than 16 years old. In his trembling hands, he holds a pistol. He raises it and takes aim at the most famous American general alive. What happens next and what Patton says in response is one of the most remarkable and most revealing moments of the entire Second World War. Not because of the danger, not because of the drama, but because of what it tells us about the psychology of fanaticism. The tragedy of the Hitler Youth generation and the peculiar, complicated humanity of a man who was himself as much a force of nature as a military commander. To understand this moment fully, you have to understand the world that produced it. By 1939, the Hitler Youth, the Hitlerjugend, had been compulsory for virtually every German boy aged between 10 and 18. By the time the war began in earnest, membership stood at approximately 8 million. These were not merely Boy Scouts with flags. They were systematically indoctrinated from childhood to believe that death in service of the Reich was the highest possible honor. They were trained in weapons handling, tactical movement, and ideological obedience. Many had never known a Germany that was not Nazi Germany. For them, surrender was not a rational option. It was a category that simply did not exist. As Allied forces swept into Germany in early 1945, they encountered a disturbing phenomenon. Resistance not from hardened SS veterans, but from children, boys of 14, 15, and 16 years old armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and pistols launching suicidal attacks on Allied columns. Some were members of the Volkssturm, the last-ditch people's militia, and others acted entirely on their own initiative, driven by a fanaticism so deeply ingrained that the approaching end of the war had only sharpened it. Allied commanders had issued standing orders. Treat all armed combatants as combatants regardless of age. The situation confronting Patton's command was not merely military. It was moral. It was psychological. It was the accumulated consequence of 12 years of a state deliberately engineering its children into weapons. Patton himself had seen this before. His Third Army had fought through France, the Lorraine, the Battle of the Bulge, and into Germany itself, covering over 1,600 kilometers in less than a year. He had watched his men die. He had driven his columns until they outran their own supply lines. He was not a sentimental man. He was famously, brutally unsentimental. A man who slapped a shell-shocked soldier in a hospital, and was nearly court-martialed for it. He believed that softness killed men, and that war demanded a particular species of ruthlessness that was incompatible with mercy. And yet, the specific incident accounts vary in their detail. As with so many stories attached to figures of Patton's mythological status, the record is somewhat impressionistic, reported by soldiers present and later repeated through the oral tradition of the Third Army. But the essential shape of events is consistent. Patton's vehicle had slowed or stopped in a German town. A young boy, no older than 16, emerged from the ruins or from a crowd of Germans, armed with a pistol, apparently intent on shooting the general. He raised the weapon, and was immediately seized by Patton's security detail. What Patton said next, according to those present, was something to this effect: "Don't shoot him. He's just a boy." If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. In some accounts, Patton is said to have gone further, approaching the boy, looking at him directly, and remarking with something between contempt and sadness that this child had been sent to do a man's work by men who were already running for their lives. In the broader reconstruction of his words and actions during this period, drawn from the memoirs of officers who served with him, and from Patton's own diary entries, A consistent picture emerges. Patton's anger in the final weeks of the war was directed not at German boys with pistols, but at the system that had put pistols in their hands, and convinced them that this was glory. This is worth pausing on because it runs counter to Patton's carefully constructed public image as a blood and thunder warrior who existed purely in the register of aggression. What the incident reveals is something more complex. A man whose understanding of war included a clear-eyed reading of what fanaticism actually was and where it actually came from. Comparisons are instructive here. The German military in its dying months had deliberately deployed children. As a strategic calculation, the Volkssturm had been created by decree in September 1944, conscripting males aged 16 to 60. Some Hitler Youth units were formally incorporated into SS divisions. There were boys fighting in the defense of Berlin, who had not yet sat their school examinations. The Wehrmacht and the SS, by contrast, maintained at least a notional distinction between military combatants and civilians. But by 1945, that distinction had largely dissolved, and the children were the most vivid expression of that dissolution. The American approach, by necessity, had to be pragmatic. A boy with a Panzerfaust could destroy an armored vehicle just as effectively as a man with one. Allied forces in the final months of the campaign reported numerous casualties inflicted by teenage combatants, and the standing orders reflected that reality. But there was a difference between policy and individual response, and Patton's response, however briefly and perhaps theatrically expressed, acknowledged that difference. The psychological impact of encountering child soldiers on Allied forces should not be underestimated. Veterans who later wrote about the final push into Germany describe a particular species of discomfort associated with these encounters. A dissonance between the training that said, "Armed combatant, respond accordingly," and the human instinct that said, "This is a child." The Third Army's after-action reports from this period note a number of incidents involving young combatants, and the general consensus amongst regimental commanders was that the situation was managed with what one officer described as measured restraint, where the tactical situation permitted. Patton's explicit instruction not to shoot the boy who had tried to shoot him falls squarely within that framework. But it also transcends it. It was not merely an act of tactical calculation. It was a statement about culpability. It drew a line, however informally, between those who had chosen this war and those who had been delivered into it before they were old enough to choose anything at all. The legacy of this moment radiates outward in several directions. It anticipates debates that would not be formally articulated for decades about child soldiers, about the moral responsibility of states that deploy them, about the culpability of individuals shaped entirely by systems of indoctrination. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, grappled with the question of individual responsibility within totalitarian systems. The Hitler Youth generation would spend the rest of the 20th century reckoning with what had been done to them and what they had done in return. Patton himself was dead before the year was out, killed not by a German boy with a pistol, but by a road accident in December 1945, his neck broken in a collision near Mannheim. He never wrote about this specific incident in the formal record, which is consistent with the nature of the man. He was interested in the broad sweep of things, not in cataloging his own moments of restraint. What survives is what those around him remembered, and what they remembered was that he had looked at a boy who had tried to kill him and seen not an enemy, but a victim. The 16-year-old boy, whoever he was, almost certainly survived the war. What became of him afterwards, whether he spent his life in the shadow of that moment, or whether it receded into the general amnesia of the defeated, is unknown. The records do not speak to individual boys on roadsides in Bavaria in the spring of 1945. There were too many of them. And that, in the end, is the point. Return to that road in Bavaria, the dust settling, the war grinding to its conclusion in the ruins of 1,000 towns like this one. A boy stands with a trembling pistol pointed at the most feared American general in Europe. And the general says, "Don't shoot him." It is not a dramatic gesture. It is not a speech. It is 4 words spoken by a man who had ordered the deaths of thousands of soldiers. Men who had chosen to fight. Men who had put on uniforms and picked up weapons in service of a cause they believed in or feared to resist. This boy had done the same, technically, but Patton understood. With the blunt clarity of a man who had no patience for self-deception. That there was a difference. The machine that had made this boy into a weapon had already been broken. The war was over. Pulling the trigger now would not be war. It would be something else. 8 million children had passed through the Hitler Youth. Hundreds of thousands had fought in the final months of the campaign. Pain. Some had died. Some had killed. Many had been used up and discarded by a regime that told them their deaths were meaningful and then ran away when the meaning collapsed. What Patton said about that particular boy was, in a sense, what he might have said about all of them. He was just a boy. The Third Army's war in Europe ended on 9th, 1945. In less than 11 months of combat, Patton's command had advanced farther and faster than any army in the history of mechanized warfare. He had driven his men to the edge of what was humanly possible and sometimes beyond it. He had been brilliant and brutal, and impossible, and on a dusty road in Bavaria in the last weeks of the war unexpectedly merciful. The pistol had been lowered. The boy had been allowed to live. And what that tells us about war. About what it requires of men and what it does to children. And where the line between the two is drawn is something that echoes far beyond the spring of 1945. It echoes still. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel.